Sullivan Cave sits about 10 miles south of Bloomington, Indiana, buried under farmland that looks like every other stretch of quiet countryside in the Midwest. But underneath all that normal-looking dirt is nearly 10 miles of mapped limestone passages that twist and drop and squeeze through the earth like some kind of geological nightmare. It's the fourth longest cave in Indiana, and honestly, one of the most brutal to navigate. The kind of place that makes experienced cavers nervous and inexperienced ones absolutely terrified. The Karst Conservancy owns it now, and they're pretty serious about who gets to go down there. You can't just show up with a flashlight and a sense of adventure. There's an application process, waivers to sign, and they make it very clear that this isn't a place for casual tourists looking to post cave selfies on Instagram. They want experienced cavers only, people who know what they're doing and understand that caves don't care about your comfort or safety. Sullivan doesn't forgive mistakes. It just swallows them up and keeps going. People have been exploring Sullivan Cave for over 100 years. Deep inside, there's this section called Backbreaker, and let me tell you, whoever named it wasn't being cute or dramatic. It's a belly-crawl tunnel so low that you literally cannot lift your head. Your face is maybe 2 inches from the rock floor, and the ceiling scrapes your spine the whole way through. There are carvings in the walls from the 1800s, these scratchy old signatures from people who clearly had the same masochistic urge to push themselves through impossibly tight spaces. You look at those carvings and realize that human beings have been doing stupid, brave things for generations. We just can't help ourselves. Over the decades, explorers kept finding new passages, new vertical drops, new ways to get completely turned around in the dark. The cave system just kept expanding on the maps, getting more complex, more dangerous. By the 90s, Sullivan had developed this reputation in the Indiana caving community as a place where even skilled people could get seriously lost. The passages all look the same down there. Wet limestone, dripping water, darkness that goes on forever. One wrong turn and you're in a completely different section of the cave with no idea how to get back. That's when vandalism started becoming a problem. People were going in there and trashing the place, breaking formations that took thousands of years to form, spray painting walls, leaving garbage everywhere. It was heartbreaking for the people who actually cared about preserving these underground spaces. So the Conservancy installed a heavy steel gate at the entrance, the kind you'd see on a bank vault. From then on, only authorized groups with a key could get in, and once you were inside, you had to lock it behind you. That was the rule. Lock it. Keep the vandals out, keep the cavers accountable, make sure nobody unauthorized could wander in and get themselves killed. On September 17, 2017, Lucas showed up for his first trip with Indiana University's Caving Club. He was 19, a sophomore studying something practical like business or engineering, but he was the kind of kid who got genuinely excited about doing stuff that made most people uncomfortable. He wasn't reckless exactly, but he had this hunger for experiences that felt real and unfiltered. He'd signed up for the club at the beginning of the semester specifically because he wanted to do something different, something that felt like a real adventure instead of just going to parties and sitting in lecture halls pretending to care about supply chain management or whatever. When the club announced a trip to Sullivan Cave, he was immediately in. This was exactly what he'd been looking for. Something that actually got his heart pumping, something he could tell stories about later. That Sunday morning, 12 people gathered in the parking area near the cave entrance. It was overcast and cool, maybe low 60s, which is pretty much perfect weather for spending hours crawling around in a damp hole in the ground. The group was a mix of experienced cavers and newer members like Lucas. There was the usual pre-trip energy, people checking their gear, adjusting helmets, making jokes to cover up nervousness. Lucas made a decision that morning that seemed totally reasonable at the time. He looked at his jacket sitting in the back seat of the car, thought about how much he was going to sweat once they got moving underground, and left it there. It was a decent jacket too, warm enough to matter. But in his mind, he was going to be crawling through tight spaces, climbing over rocks, working up a sweat. Why carry extra weight when it was just going to get hot and uncomfortable? The cave stayed at 55 degrees year-round, sure, but he'd be moving around. He'd be fine. He grabbed his backpack instead, stuffed 2 Clif bars and 2 water bottles inside, made sure his headlamp was working, checked that he had his phone even though there obviously wouldn't be any signal underground, and followed the group down a short trail through the woods. The trees were dense enough that even in daylight, it felt a little darker than it should. Like the forest was preparing you for what came next. At around 10:30, they reached the gate. It was this big metal thing, really solid, with a serious padlock that looked like it could stop a tank. The staff supervisor, a guy in his late 20s who'd been caving since high school, pulled out the key, and there was something kind of ceremonial about the way that lock clicked open. Like they were entering somewhere they weren't really supposed to be. Crossing a threshold into a different world. The temperature dropped the moment they stepped inside. It goes to about 55 degrees year-round in there, which doesn't sound that cold until you realize you're going to be sitting still or moving slowly through water for hours. The air smelled like wet stone and earth, that particular cave smell that's hard to describe but impossible to forget. It's ancient and mineral and slightly rotten all at once. Your lungs kind of have to adjust to it. The supervisor made a point of locking the gate behind them. Click. Everyone heard it. That was the rule, and it was drilled into every caving group that went in there. Lock it so nobody else can get in, lock it so you're accountable for getting everyone back out. The key went into his pocket, and they headed deeper into the cave. They split into 2 groups of 6 to make navigation easier. Lucas ended up in the second group, following behind some of the more experienced members. For the next 3 hours, he had the time of his life. They squeezed through passages barely wider than their bodies that opened into these massive rooms with ceilings that disappeared into darkness above their headlamp beams. Cathedral-like spaces that made you feel tiny and insignificant in the best possible way. They crawled through mud, climbed over breakdown piles where chunks of ceiling had collapsed centuries ago, splashed through shallow pools of crystal-clear water that was probably cleaner than anything coming out of a tap. Lucas was laughing, talking with the others, completely absorbed in how alien and beautiful everything looked down there. Someone pointed out flowstone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. Someone else showed him cave pearls, these perfect little spheres of calcite that form in pools over hundreds of years. This was exactly the kind of experience he'd wanted. This was the stuff you couldn't get from a textbook or a screen. This was real. The 3 hours passed way faster than it felt. Eventually, though, someone checked their watch and said they should probably start heading back. They had to be out by a certain time, and caves have a way of taking longer to navigate than you expect. So they turned around and started retracing their path toward the entrance. Then, on the way back out, they reached Backbreaker. The veterans in the group went first, dropping to their bellies and disappearing into what looked like a crack in the wall. It wasn't even a passage in any real sense. It was just a gap between layers of rock, maybe 18 inches high at its tallest point, that you had to squeeze through for about 50 feet. Lucas watched them go, one after another, their lights disappearing into the tunnel, and felt his chest tighten. The opening looked impossibly small. Like something designed to trap you. One of the experienced cavers crawled back out for a second and gave Lucas some advice. Take your time. Push your pack ahead of you, keep your arms stretched out in front, and don't try to lift your head. Just slide forward using your toes and elbows. If you start to panic, stop and breathe. The rock's not going anywhere. When Lucas's turn came, he could feel panic starting to edge into his thoughts. That hole looked impossibly small. Instead of taking a breath and going slowly like he should have, like he'd just been told to do, he decided to just go for it. Get it over with. Don't think about it, just move. He shoved his backpack ahead of him and pushed forward into the tunnel. The rock closed around him immediately. His helmet scraped against the ceiling. His shoulders pressed against both walls. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He could smell the limestone, taste the mineral dust in the air. His headlamp beam bounced off the walls inches from his face, creating this claustrophobic tunnel of light with darkness pressing in from all sides. About halfway through, everything went wrong. His backpack caught on something overhead. The strap snagged on an outcropping of rock that jutted down from the ceiling. He tried to back up but his shoulders wedged against the sides. He tried to push forward but the pack wouldn't budge and his chest was compressed against the floor and he genuinely could not move in any direction. Not forward, not backward, not side to side. He was stuck. That's when real panic hit. Not the nervous anticipation from before, but actual terror. The kind that makes your heart hammer so hard you can hear it in your ears. The kind that makes breathing difficult even when there's plenty of air. He thrashed against the rock, scraping his back, banging his helmet against the ceiling, trying to force his body backward. Nothing worked. He was trapped in a space barely wider than his shoulders, unable to lift his head, unable to get enough air into his compressed lungs to even yell properly. He tried to stay calm. Tried to remember the advice he'd been given. Breathe. Don't panic. But his body wasn't listening to his brain anymore. His legs were kicking uselessly, his hands were clawing at the rock, his breath was coming in short gasps that weren't getting enough oxygen. He thought about the tons of rock above him, the weight of the entire earth pressing down. He thought about being stuck there forever, about dying in this tiny space with his face pressed against cold stone. 15 minutes. That's how long he struggled in there, though it probably felt like hours. Maybe days. Time does weird things when you're panicking in the dark. Finally, running on pure adrenaline and fear, he managed to twist one arm out of his backpack strap. It scraped against the rock and he felt something tear, either his shirt or his skin, he couldn't tell. Then the other arm came free. He shoved the pack as hard as he could, felt it break free from whatever had caught it, and then wriggled forward like he was being borne through solid rock. Elbows, toes, scraping and pushing and trying not to think about getting stuck again until he finally emerged on the other side. He lay there gasping, heart hammering, covered in sweat despite the cold. Relief washed over him so intensely he felt dizzy. He'd made it. He was through. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. But in his panic and disorientation, he didn't pay attention to which direction the others had gone. There were multiple passages branching off from where he'd emerged, and they all looked identical in the bouncing light of his headlamp. Rough gray walls, moisture glistening on the stone, darkness in every direction. He could hear his own breathing, his own heartbeat, but nothing else. He picked what he thought was the right tunnel and started moving, just wanting to catch up with the group, wanting to be around other people again. After a few minutes, something felt off. The passage seemed wrong somehow. Too quiet. The walls didn't look familiar. He stopped and listened for voices, for the sound of other people moving through the cave, for the scrape of boots on stone or the echo of conversation. Nothing. Just the kind of absolute silence that only exists underground, where there's no wind, no distant traffic, no birds, no insects. Nothing but the sound of water dripping somewhere far away and his own pulse in his ears. That's when he realized he was lost. He called out. His voice sounded strange and flat in the dead air. He waited. Called again, louder this time. Nothing came back, not even an echo. The cave just swallowed his voice like it had never existed. Like he'd never made a sound. Following proper caving protocol, which had been drilled into them during the pre-trip briefing, Lucas decided to stay put. If you're lost, you don't wander around making things worse. You stay where you are and wait for someone to come find you. It's basic wilderness survival adapted for caves. So he sat down on the cold stone and waited, listening for any sound of the group coming back for him. Half an hour passed. Then an hour. The silence pressed against his ears like something physical. He started thinking about how far underground he was, how many tons of rock sat between him and the surface. Hundreds of feet of solid limestone. He thought about the group moving farther away with every minute, getting closer to the exit while he sat alone in the dark. He tried to stay calm, tried to remember his training, but his mind kept racing with increasingly anxious thoughts. What if they didn't realize he was missing? What if they thought he'd gone ahead somehow, or was in the other group? What if they'd already left? Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Sitting still was driving him crazy. He stood up and started moving again, scanning the walls with his headlamp for any kind of clue, any marking that might tell him which way to go. That's when he noticed them, faint arrows scratched into the rock. They were old, the lines worn smooth by time and moisture. Carved by previous explorers as directional markers. Arrows in caves typically point toward airflow, and airflow means you're heading toward an exit. Fresh air has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is usually a connection to the surface. It gave him something to follow, at least. Some hope. Some sense that he wasn't just wandering randomly through an endless maze. He moved carefully through the passages, checking each arrow, making sure he didn't miss any turns. The tunnels twisted and branched, dropping down sometimes, climbing up others. His legs were getting tired. His shoulders ached from the constant crouching and crawling. But he kept following those arrows, trusting that whoever had carved them knew what they were doing. Gradually, he started to see something ahead. A glow. Dim and gray, but definitely light. Not the yellow beam of a headlamp, but actual natural light. Daylight. Natural light in a cave is the most beautiful thing you'll ever see. It means the world still exists. It means you're not going to die in the dark. He started moving faster, scrambling over rocks, splashing through water, not caring about the noise he was making. The light grew brighter. He could see the mouth of the cave ahead, could see the gate, could see trees and sky beyond it, and he felt this surge of relief so powerful it almost knocked him over. He'd made it. He'd found his way out. Everything was going to be okay. Then he got close enough to see clearly. The gate was locked. The heavy padlock hung there, solid and immovable. Beyond it, through the bars, he could see the parking lot. It was empty. Completely empty. No cars, no people, no sign that anyone had ever been there. His group was gone. They'd left without him. He grabbed the bars and shook them, yelling until his throat felt raw. The padlock held firm. He yelled some more, screaming for help, but there was no response except the wind moving through the trees outside. Just wind and birds and the normal sounds of a September afternoon in Indiana. The world was going on without him like nothing was wrong. What Lucas didn't know was that his group had done a head count before leaving. The supervisor had gathered everyone around and counted heads. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. 12 people. That's how many had gone in, and that's how many he counted. Nobody had actually checked to make sure Lucas specifically was there. Nobody had done a buddy check or called out names. They just counted bodies, gotten to 12, and that was that. 12 people standing in the parking lot. Must be everyone. They'd locked the gate like they were supposed to, loaded up the cars, and driven away, unknowingly leaving one of their own trapped inside Sullivan Cave. As the reality of his situation sank in, Lucas felt something cold settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was locked inside Sullivan Cave. Alone. With 2 Cliff Bars and 2 bottles of water. No jacket. No cell service. And based on that empty parking lot, nobody had any idea he was missing. He pulled out his phone, even though he knew it was pointless. No signal. Not even a single bar. He tried calling anyway. Nothing. He tried texting his roommate, his parents, anyone. The messages just sat there with little failed to send icons. The phone was useless, but he kept it anyway. At least it had a flashlight function, even if the battery wouldn't last long. At first, he tried to stay calm and think rationally. Someone would notice, right? They'd get back to campus and realize he wasn't there. His roommate would wonder where he was. Someone would remember that Lucas had been on the caving trip. They'd put 2 and 2 together and come back. Maybe that evening. He just had to wait a few hours. He ate one Cliff Bar, trying to make it last, chewing slowly even though he wanted to devour the whole thing. Drank some water, just a few sips, trying to ration it. He had no idea how long he'd be stuck in here. Could be a few hours, could be longer. Better to conserve what he had. He sat near the gate where he could see outside and tried not to think about how cold he was already getting. Without the physical exertion of moving through the cave, the 55-degree temperature felt much worse. His shirt was damp with sweat from the panic in Backbreaker and the scramble to find the exit. Now that sweat was turning cold against his skin. He started shivering. The afternoon dragged on. He watched the light change outside, watched shadows grow longer across the parking lot. Still nobody came. He tried yelling a few more times, but his voice was getting hoarse and he was starting to accept that there was nobody within earshot anyway. The cave was in the middle of nowhere. You couldn't just hear someone screaming from the road. When evening came, the temperature seemed to drop even more. Or maybe his body was just running out of heat. He was shivering constantly now, his teeth chattering. And then he noticed movement deeper in the cave. Bats. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, emerging from wherever they'd been sleeping all day. They poured out of the darkness in a living stream, flying past him toward the gate, squeezing through the gaps between the bars and disappearing into the twilight to hunt for insects. Lucas had always thought bats were kind of cool in an abstract way, but up close in the dark, they were terrifying. Their wings made this leathery rustling sound. Their tiny faces looked alien in his headlamp beam. And he absolutely knew, that bats could carry rabies. It wasn't common, but it happened. The last thing he needed was to get bitten by a rabid bat and die of a disease that makes you afraid of water while you're already dying of thirst in a cave. The universe had a sense of irony, but that would be pushing it. He backed away from the entrance, retreating deeper into the cave to avoid the bat exodus. He found a spot about 100 feet from the gate, in a small alcove where a little bit of moonlight still filtered through from the entrance. Enough to see vague shapes, at least. Enough to not be in complete darkness. The floor was solid limestone covered in loose gravel. Without his jacket, without any kind of padding or insulation, it felt like lying on a slab in a refrigerator. He curled up on his side in the fetal position, trying to preserve body heat, tucking his hands under his arms. He attempted to sleep, but it didn't really work. Every time he started to drift off, the cold would jolt him awake, or he'd hear something moving in the darkness, or his mind would start racing with increasingly dark thoughts about what would happen if nobody came back. What if they thought he'd just decided not to show up? What if they thought he'd caught a ride back with someone else? What if they didn't realize anyone was missing at all? He forced himself to stop thinking like that. Someone would notice. His roommate would notice he wasn't in their room. His parents would call if they didn't hear from him for a few days. Someone would come looking. He just had to survive until then. The night was endless. He'd never experienced darkness like that before. Even with his headlamp on, pointed at the ceiling to save battery, the darkness beyond the small circle of light felt alive. Like it was watching him. Waiting for his light to die so it could swallow him completely. By the second day, his water was gone. Both bottles empty. He'd tried to ration it, really had tried, but his body needed water. Especially in the cold, even though you don't feel thirsty the same way you do in heat. His remaining Cliff Bar sat in his backpack, and he eyed it constantly, trying to decide when to eat it. Save it for later? Eat it now to keep his energy up? There was no good answer. Thirst started becoming a real problem. His mouth felt dry and sticky, his lips were cracking. His tongue felt thick. He remembered reading somewhere that you can survive 3 weeks without food but only 3 days without water. Was that true? He couldn't remember. His thinking was getting fuzzy. In desperation, he started licking the cave walls where moisture had condensed on the limestone. It helped a little, but not much. The dampness on the walls wasn't really drinkable water, just enough moisture to keep his tongue from feeling like sandpaper. It tasted mineral and slightly bitter. He tried to convince himself he was staying hydrated, but he knew he was just delaying the inevitable. That's when he started writing notes to his family. He'd brought a small notebook in his backpack, something he used for class notes, and now he pulled it out and started writing by headlamp light. His hands were shaking from the cold, making his handwriting messy, but he kept going. Dear Mom and Dad. I'm sorry. I love you. I should have been more careful. I should have stayed with the group. Tell Sarah I'm sorry I won't make it to her graduation. The words felt inadequate and overdramatic at the same time. How do you write a goodbye letter when you're 19 and you never expected to need one? He wrote to his parents, his sister, a couple of close friends. He tried to make them meaningful, tried to explain what happened without making it sound like anyone's fault. It was an accident. Just a stupid accident. He folded the papers carefully and put them in his pocket, right next to his dead phone. If they found his body, at least they'd have something. The thought of his body being found made him feel sick. He imagined the searchers eventually opening the gate, finding him curled up near the entrance, dead from exposure or dehydration or both. He imagined his parents getting the news. He imagined his sister crying. He had to stop thinking about that. By that night, his phone battery had died completely. He'd been checking it periodically even though there was no signal, just out of habit, watching the battery percentage tick down. 80%. 60. 40. 20. Then nothing. Just a dead black rectangle. His backup flashlight had somehow disappeared, maybe dropped during his panic in Backbreaker or lost during his scramble through the passages. All he had left was his headlamp, and he had no idea how much battery it had. Could be hours, could be days. When it died, he'd be in absolute darkness. Not regular darkness where your eyes adjust and you can see vague shapes. Cave darkness, where you literally cannot see your hand touching your nose. Sensory deprivation darkness. The kind that makes people hallucinate and lose their minds. He started turning the headlamp off for long periods, sitting in the dark to save battery. It was terrifying, but necessary. He'd turn it on for a few minutes, look around to reassure himself that he was still in the real world, then turn it off again and sit in the blackness, listening to the silence and the distant drip of water. Day 3 was worse. Over 48 hours had passed since he'd been locked in. Lucas was weak now, genuinely weak in a way he'd never experienced before. Standing up made him dizzy. His legs shook when he walked. He was shivering constantly despite trying to do jumping jacks and push-ups to stay warm and generate body heat. His body was running out of fuel. His lips were split and bleeding. His tongue felt swollen in his mouth. The hunger had mostly passed, replaced by a kind of hollow nausea, but the thirst was unbearable. It was all he could think about. Water. His body was screaming for water. He went back to licking the cave walls, pressing his tongue against the cold stone like some kind of desperate animal. He didn't care how pathetic it looked. There was nobody there to see him anyway. At one point, he saw a cricket crawling across the cave floor. It was about an inch long, dark brown, moving slowly in the cold. He actually caught it and sat there holding it, seriously considering eating the thing. He'd read somewhere that insects are nutritious, high in protein, that people in survival situations eat bugs all the time. Bear Grylls did it on TV, right? He held that cricket for a long time, looking at it in his headlamp beam, trying to work up the will to just bite down and swallow. But he couldn't do it. The idea of feeling it crunch in his mouth, of tasting whatever a cricket tasted like, of feeling its legs scraping down his throat, was too much. He was hungry, but he wasn't that hungry yet. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe if he made it to day 4. Finally, he let it go and watched it disappear into a crack in the rocks. He ate his last Cliff Bar that afternoon, making it last as long as possible, chewing each bite slowly. Chocolate chip. It tasted like the best thing he'd ever eaten, and it was gone way too fast. Now he had nothing. No food, no water, no warmth. Just time and darkness and the slow realization that he might actually die down here. That evening, as the third night approached, Lucas dragged himself back to his spot near the gate and just lay down on the cold stone. He was too exhausted to think clearly anymore, too tired to be scared. Part of him wondered if he'd just fall asleep and not wake up. Hypothermia, dehydration, take your pick. He'd heard it wasn't a bad way to go, supposedly. You just get confused and tired and then it's over. You dream about being warm, and then you're gone. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about anything. Tried not to think about his family or his friends or all the things he'd never get to do. Tried not to think about how stupid he'd been, getting separated from the group. Tried not to think about the fact that he was going to die at 19 because of a series of small mistakes that shouldn't have added up to something fatal but somehow did. Then he saw light. At first, he thought he was hallucinating. His headlamp was off, he was sure of it, but there was definitely light moving somewhere nearby. Not the dim glow of moonlight through the gate, but a bright, focused beam. A headlamp. It grew brighter, steadier, coming from deeper in the cave. He heard sounds. Footsteps. Boots on stone. Keys jangling. Keys. Lucas forced himself to sit up. His head spun and he almost passed out. He tried to yell but his voice came out as barely a croak. It was pathetic, barely audible, but he tried again. He stumbled toward the gate, legs shaking, using the wall for support. The light was definitely getting closer. And then he saw him, a figure on the other side of the gate. A man with a headlamp and a key ring. It was one of the caving club leaders. The same guy who'd locked the gate 60 hours earlier. When the leader saw Lucas's face through the bars, he froze. His expression went from confusion to shock to horror in about 2 seconds. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, trying key after key until he found the right one. The lock clicked open and he yanked the gate aside, rushing through. He caught Lucas as his legs gave out, lowering him to the ground. The leader happened to be an EMT, trained in wilderness first response, and he immediately started checking Lucas over. Pulse, breathing, pupil response. Asking questions about when he'd last eaten, last drunk water, what day it was, how many fingers he was holding up. Lucas was dehydrated, hypothermic, and exhausted, but he was conscious and reasonably alert considering everything. After 60 hours of hell, his body had held on just long enough. A few more hours, maybe half a day, and it would have been a very different story. The leader pulled out his phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. He gave Lucas water from his own bottle, making him drink slowly so he wouldn't throw up. Then he helped him to his feet and started walking him out, supporting most of his weight. Lucas managed to ask how they knew to come back. The leader explained that someone had noticed his jacket still in the car, and that's when they realized he'd never returned. They offered to take him to the hospital, insisted on it actually, but Lucas refused. He could barely think straight, but he knew he didn't want to spend more time in institutional spaces. He just wanted to go back to his dorm and sleep in his own bed. He wanted to be warm. He wanted to be around people. He wanted to pretend this whole thing had never happened. Before he left the cave, though, he did something that kind of perfectly captures who he was as a person. He gathered up all his trash. The empty Cliff Bar wrappers, the empty water bottles, all of it. After 60 hours of hell, after thinking he was going to die in there, after being so weak he could barely stand, he still didn't want to leave garbage behind. The leader tried to tell him not to worry about it, that they could get it later, but Lucas insisted. Leave no trace. That was the rule. When everything got pieced together later, when the caving club had to file reports and explain what happened, the mistakes were obvious and painful. The head count had been sloppy. Nobody had done a proper buddy check. Nobody had called out names or made sure each specific person was accounted for. They just counted heads in the parking lot and assumed everyone was there. 12 people. Must be right. Nobody thought to verify who those 12 people actually were. It wasn't until they got back to campus, until someone happened to walk past Lucas's car and noticed his jacket sitting there in the back seat, that anyone realized something was wrong. Then it was a panicked scramble to figure out what had happened. They called Lucas's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They checked his dorm, but his roommate said he hadn't seen him since that morning. They called everyone who'd been on the trip, trying to figure out if anyone had seen him leave separately, if maybe he'd gotten a ride with someone else. Nothing. And finally, someone had the terrible realization that maybe, just maybe, he was still in the cave. The leader who'd done the original headcount felt sick. He grabbed the keys and drove back to Sullivan Cave immediately, alone, probably breaking every traffic law on the way. He was already imagining the worst. 60 hours without food or water in 55-degree temperatures. If Lucas was still alive, it would be a miracle. When he opened that gate and saw Lucas standing there, barely, he almost couldn't believe it. Part of him had been expecting to find a body. The investigation afterward was thorough and brutal. The caving club was suspended for a semester. New protocols were put in place, mandatory buddy systems, name-by-name roll calls, multiple headcounts at different points during the trip. The kind of stuff that should have been standard procedure all along but somehow wasn't. The supervisor who'd done the headcount quit the club entirely, too guilt-ridden to continue. None of it was malicious. Nobody wanted this to happen. It was just a cascade of small oversights that added up to something catastrophic. And that jacket. That stupid jacket that Lucas had left in the car because he thought he'd get too hot. The jacket he'd spent 3 days wishing he had, shivering on cold stone, imagining how much better things would be if he just had something warm to wrap around himself. That jacket saved his life, just not in the way anyone would expect. If he'd taken it with him, there would have been nothing in the car to indicate anyone was still inside the cave. The club might have spent days trying to figure out where Lucas had disappeared to, calling his family, filing missing person reports, before anyone thought to check Sullivan Cave. And by then, it would have been way too late. He would have been dead for days. So yeah, that jacket saved his life. The decision not to bring it created the breadcrumb trail that brought someone back to unlock that gate. Sometimes the smallest decisions, the ones that seem totally insignificant at the time, the ones you don't even really think about, end up being the difference between living and dying. Lucas decided not to bring a jacket because he thought he'd get too hot. That decision almost killed him from the cold, but it also created the only clue that he was missing. The thing he needed most to survive became the thing that saved him, just in a completely backwards way. You can call it luck, fate, providence, whatever you want. I just call it the universe having a seriously weird sense of timing. And maybe, just maybe, a reminder that we should pay attention to the small choices we make, because we never really know which ones are going to matter. Lucas recovered pretty quickly, all things considered. Youth and general good health will do that. He was back in class within a week, though he said the first few nights in his dorm were rough. He kept waking up thinking he was still in the cave, still in the dark. It took a while for his brain to accept that he was actually safe. He never went caving again. Can't say I blame him. Some adventures you only need to have once.